this and let people in. And we have participants joining us, which is very exciting to see the numbers going up. Hello and welcome to those of you who are joining us in Zoom. We are behind the scenes right now at Yale Alumni Live with Michael Morand. We're very happy to have all of you, and we are going to just give everyone a few minutes to join us this evening, and then we are going to go live both here in Zoom and in Facebook. So we will give everybody an opportunity to get in and get settled. Perhaps grab yourself a cocktail or a little dinner, since we are at the 7 p.m. hour, which is 4 o'clock for our friends on the West Coast. Something that we always like to do at Yale Alumni Live is invite you to put in the chat where you are watching from. We love to see where everyone is and welcome you from afar. We're taking you literally into New Haven this evening, which is really exciting for us to be able to bring you local to campus, since it's been a while since many of you have been back. So as everyone is filtering in, my name is Stephanie, and I am a member of the regional clubs team at the Yale Alumni Association. I'm very excited to be here with you all tonight. Oh, I'm so excited. We have folks writing in the chat where they're from. We've got someone from Glencoe, Illinois, from Seattle, Washington, Manhattan, Cleveland, Ohio, Los Angeles, Bradley Ave, New Haven. Welcome. So happy to have you. Marlborough, Mass. So this is great. We always like to have representation from all of Ontario, all over the world. Texas, Hartford. This is great. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We're just a few minutes out from getting started. For those of you who have ever watched a Yale Alumni Live previously, you know that we do a little bit behind the scenes here in Zoom, and then we tether this over to Facebook so that alums who are in the Yale Alumni Facebook group can also watch us live. So give us a few minutes to get settled in here. We'll get started with Michael Morand and Grove Street Cemetery. We're very happy to have you. I just absolutely love seeing the people listing where they're from, because we've got folks from everywhere: Clinton, Guilford, White Plains, Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is so great. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. We're really excited to offer this special Yale Alumni Live with Michael. It's Grove Street Cemetery. So we're going to get started in just a minute.
Since I went to the divinity school, I'm moved that it's like the line in scripture, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses.
Yes, I love that.
People, including a number of friends.
I love it. It's wonderful. California, New Haven, and Milford. Love it. Love seeing all of you here. They love your y'all shirt, Michael.
Yeah, so this is, as you'll learn more, I have Kentucky roots, and this is made by a group called Kentucky for Kentucky. So you can find them online, and y'all in every possible kind of sweatshirt, t-shirt, socks, onesies.
We love the y'all. I went to school in Virginia, so y'all became absolutely a part of my vocabulary quickly during my time there. So once again, I just want to welcome everyone here to Yale Alumni Live tonight. For those of you who've been watching Yale Alumni Lives, you know that we do a little bit behind the scenes here in Zoom, and then we tether over to Facebook, where we have 20,000 member strong Yale Alumni Facebook group, which is a private group, and there's lots of great activities going on in there, great connections, and we like to do this in both spaces. So everyone is going to have to bear with me for 1 second, because I am going to add us to Facebook, and we're going to go live in just one moment on both sites, and we're going to get started with Michael Morand. So thank you all so much for being here, and we're going to get started in just a moment. If you do have any questions throughout the program tonight, please feel free to put those into the Q&A section, and I will get those over to Michael at the end of the program. So I think that we are going to be live in just 1 second. I'm going to hit the button, and then we're going to get started with our program this evening. Thank you all again for being here. This is a very exciting night for us. We've been on a little hiatus, so we're glad to be back and here with you, Michael. All right, so I think that we are ready to go in just one moment. So Thank you all so much for being here. This is a little non-traditional. I'm doing it all myself tonight. We usually have my friend Kevin Winston, who is an admin for the Yale Alumni Facebook group, who helps us with this. But tonight it's Michael and I, and we've got our big bold Yale shirts on, and we're really excited to welcome all of you here for another Yale Alumni Live. Those of you who are now watching in Facebook, and those of you who have already heard me say this in Zoom, we do this in both platforms. So you can ask questions in both platforms, whether you're watching in Zoom or you're watching on Facebook. I am very pleased to be here. My name is Stephanie. I am a member of the regional clubs team at the Yale Alumni Association, and Yale Alumni Live is something that we've been doing since mid-March, when things kind of took a turn and we started doing some virtual programming, and we love bringing alumni to the stage to tell their stories. And tonight we are very happy to be joined by Michael Morand, who has 2 degrees from Yale, as many of you probably know, and has been a staple in our community for quite some time. He is going to tell us all about Grove Street Cemetery this evening, but we're going to get started by showing you a quick video that was compiled just last week. So you're going to see some beautiful fall foliage and the absolutely amazing Grove Street Cemetery. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you. I'm going to show you this video, and then we're going to get started with Michael telling us everything there is to know in 40 minutes about Grove Street Cemetery. So we are going to switch over to here, and I will be back with you in just and now I can't find it. So just give me 1 second to figure out why this video went away. Oh boy, I'll tell you, you never know what's going to happen on these live streams, right, everybody? So I think I got it now. 1 second here. Let's see. Here we go, folks. So that was a really current look at Grove Street Cemetery. We hope that you enjoyed that little clip, which showed you some of the spaces that Michael's going to be talking about tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Michael Morand, who probably doesn't need very much of an introduction for our audience this evening. But Michael, thank you so much for being here. We're so happy to have you. And I figure we could get started with you just telling us a little bit about yourself and your Yale history.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks to Carissa, who's made the video and worked with us in putting this together, and everybody at the Yale Alumni Association. Welcome you all. It is great to join you. I bring you greetings virtually from the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library where I work, and actually from the banks of the Quinnipiac River where I live in wonderful New Haven. And as I look out my window, I see Grannis Island, which was the summer lands of the Quinnipiac people. And so I want to acknowledge that we in New Haven are on the ancestral lands of the Quinnipiac people who steward these lands for generations and millennia. I want to share a little bit today about a place that I know well as one of the founding co-chairs of the Friends of the Grove Street Cemetery, a place that I have visited more than 1,000 times in my 14,000 days in New Haven and at Yale, and that I've spent a lot of time, and I'll talk a little bit about this during these quarantine and pandemic times, because there is no better place to do physical distance learning than a cemetery. And there's probably no better cemetery in which to learn than our own New Haven's own Grove Street Cemetery. So let me put my screen on and inflict a little PowerPoint on you for a little while. And many of you probably have taphophilia and don't know it. Now, I'm not a doctor, but if you're here, I think I can diagnose that you have taphophilia, a word that may be new to some, but taph, the root meaning death. Taphophilia is like bibliophilia for books, or aviophilia if you like flying. It is the love of cemeteries and funerary rites, and I certainly have it and will share it with you. It's infectious in a good way. This is obviously in the eve of All Hallows Eve, and so this is a good season to be joining together to think about those who came before us. And I want to give acknowledgement as I talk to my great mentor, who's also a great mentor to so many on this call, our great friend Judy Schiff, who really is the city historian and keeper of all the knowledge of campus and community. And so Judy is a dear friend of many of us, and anything I say right is a credit to her. Anything I get wrong, I own myself. I wish we could be physically in the cemetery. These are some snaps I took today. It is a glorious season right now in this changing of the seasons in the Grove Street Cemetery. There's O.C. Marsh of Peabody Museum fame. And there's lots of things that one can learn in this place. In the time together, I will not say everything there is to know about Grove Street Cemetery because I don't know it. And I know a few things, so but more than would fill the time we have together. And so I hope you leave this evening. I have sort of two goals. One, that you'll learn something that you didn't know before, and that you will be encouraged to go out and learn a lot more about Grove Street Cemetery, or maybe about a cemetery nearby where you live and where you are right now. There are lots of different paths one can take in any cemetery, and certainly in Grove Street. One could be Taphophilian typography. On the left, I love this stone of Julia, wife of Zeri Alling of Orange, probably of the now what's Allingtown in West Haven. There's like every possible typeface on it. It's such a wonderful stone. And on the right, I love this late 18th century stone. If you look closely at the march, at the date, you'll see that the stone carver did M-A-C-H and then came in later and did a little correction. So I like that there's a typographical error. That makes me feel better because I make them every once in a while too. One could do threads through the cemetery of faculty members of Yale. There are many faculty members of many generations, some who were great influence on me and probably on many on this call. The great John Boswell, buried here with Jerry Hart, and the wonderful legend that's so true about John, quote, "He was not a tame lion." I believe Joe Gordon and others were responsible for this stone, and it's so wonderful. On the left, Sylvia Arden Boone, the first African-American woman to be tenured in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, great scholar of West Africa and of the transatlantic influences across into our own culture. And the wonderful Mende word at the bottom, neku, which is a word that Sylvia really popularized in her scholarship in the American context, which means blackness as freshness and cleanness, and a wonderful thing that was a word that she used a lot, and it certainly was true of her. One could do, looking through at art, on the left is Hezekiah Auger, known as the first sculptor in America. And on the right is the stone of William Getzman, which a great scholar of the American West, which has a replica of a Frederick Remington statue. So you could go through and look at a place like Grove Street for its artistic and sculptural, and you could do a combination of those. One of the most beautiful humans of recent times in New Haven and on campus was Robert Reed, professor in the School of Art. And Robert's stone from the path on the left is this wonderful orb, and only when you go off the path and around you see this legend about Robert. His influence on campus and on the art world is inestimable and extraordinary. And if you don't know him, I would encourage you to get to know more about him. One of the true greats of all times, and buried for all times now in the Grove Street Cemetery. One could go through and do divinity. On the left, you see Mary Goodman, an African-American woman in New Haven who left her life savings for scholarships for African-American students at the Divinity School, a scholarship that continues in Goodman Scholars. And hats off to YDS, who in recent years and decades have really honored Mary Goodman. She's buried in one of the areas. It was a Yale plot. The trustees of Yale, when she died, offered a plot there for her in recognition of her support in the 19th century for scholarships at the Divinity School. On the right, perhaps my greatest mentor as a young person in New Haven and at Yale, the great Reverend Samuel and Sly, who died on Valentine's Day last year, and I would trust is someone known again to a number of people here. I go and pray and talk to Sam every once in a while, including today. One can obviously look at epitaphs. On the left, one of my favorite, perhaps my favorite, I knew Mrs. Sandeen a little bit, and from that interaction know that what her stone says is true, and from her family and truly close friends know that it was true. But what a great legend. What a woman, exclamation point. And perhaps another thing I hope we can all sort of think about, what do we want our stones to say? On the left, the stone of Phil Holt, who I knew very well in New Haven. And that Latin legend at the bottom is not from Horace. That is, in fact, Phil's own line, and I believe it translates into something like, women loved him, fish feared him. I want to just take one moment and explain why I am so interested in these things. And it actually goes back to my own Taphophilia. And so I want to honor my ancestors. My great-great-great-grandfather, 3 great-grandfathers, is buried in Colonia Tovar, Venezuela. He left Baden-Württemberg and went as an early group of Germans to settle in Venezuela, died within a month of arriving. His son, Joseph, went back to Europe and then came to the US through New Orleans to settle in Northern Kentucky, where my roots are. And that's Joseph's, my great-great-grandfather. His grandson, my grandfather, Martin, is on the right. And their son is this wonderful man, Joe Morand, my father, who is the father of my Taphophilia. So as a kid with my dad, we would go to cemeteries around and about. The Pioneer Cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio, where the settlers of Cincinnati are buried. And I went to school at St. Xavier High School, not too far from Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, one of the great garden cemeteries. And this probably is really the place that unlocked my Taphophilia forever. So wherever I go, I like to visit cemeteries. Cave Hill in Louisville, another one of the great garden cemeteries where one can see both Muhammad Ali and Harlan Sanders, among others. And in this time when we're limited in what we can do, Frank and I have gone to a number of cemeteries. We went down to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, great place to do socially distanced exploration, visited with James Weldon Johnson and his wife, Grace Nail Johnson, Jean-Michel Basquiat. Frank and I were out in Cleveland in September and had a chance to visit Lakeview Cemetery. I know we've got at least one person on the call from Cleveland, so probably knows this great place. Harvie Picard was, I take it, an illustrator, so that people leave pens at his grave. And I go to Ghana a lot. I miss going to Ghana. This year is the first time in 8 years I haven't gone to Ghana. And I like going to cemeteries there. On the right, the legend at the cemetery in Osu may be the best line as you leave a cemetery: remember, you will be back. And I visit the grave of W.B. Du Bois, which is actually going to bring us back home to New Haven. Du Bois, as some would know, is buried with his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who studied at the Yale School of Drama. The Du Boises are buried at their home in Accra. Du Bois left the United States and went to live in Ghana at Kwame Nkrumah's invitation early in the days of independence. Du Bois saw what was going on in America and basically said that he could not participate in the racism and oppression in America anymore, and took Nkrumah's invitation and moved to Ghana, died there, and is buried there. If he had not, he would have been buried in New Haven, because his grandfather, Alfred Du Bois, is buried in the Grove Street Cemetery. And in the early 1950s, before he had a mind to move to Ghana, he and Mrs. Du Bois had this lengthy correspondence, and I mean lengthy correspondence. You can see the letters here back and forth between Du Bois and the mayor of New Haven, Bill Celentano, and then the Grove Street Cemetery, asking, could he be buried in the Grove Street Cemetery because his grandfather had a plot there? And the answer was yes, it's a family cemetery. And the cemetery noted that he had the right to be buried there, that there were some funds owed because his grandfather had not paid for perpetual care. So in the papers of Du Bois at UMass Amherst, one can find this canceled check signed by Shirley Graham Du Bois that paid for the arrears, as it were, and to be able to be buried in the cemetery. Du Bois then writes, and this is the last part of the correspondence, that says to Grove Street Cemetery, I sent you the check, I got the canceled check, haven't heard back from you. So interesting footnote to history. It may be that Grove Street Cemetery owes the Du Boises some money. But back here, the dead shall be raised is the legend. Quick history. The cemetery became an idea in 1796. It was incorporated in 1797, and the first burial, Martha Townsend, of a longstanding family in New Haven, a family that continues today, and a family that had a burial just a few months ago of its matriarch, Doris Deb Townsend. So Martha Townsend was the first burial in 1797. The last burial to happen outside of Grove Street on the old burial ground on the green was 1812. So for a couple decades, there were burials both in Grove Street and on the green, and I'll come back to that. The cemetery was organized in its current form with the wall and the great entrance that we just saw in 1845, and the chapel, the building on the inside, the last addition was done in 1872. Why was it done at that time? It was done by James Hillhouse, who we'll meet in a moment, partly as a nation building exercise, I think, right? So America was new at the time, and Hillhouse wanted a place where people could come and take inspiration from those who came before. It was done also, I think, so that Hillhouse and people like him could be secure that their graves would stay kept forever, for eternity. And it was done for some reasons that we'll see in a moment that were very close to our own time, that echo in our own time. Until 1797, all burials were on the green. Those who know Grove Street know that on the back wall are these wonderful old New England stones. These are all from the green. They're laid out in alphabetical order on the back wall. The bodies are still on the green. So it's estimated that there are perhaps 3,000 graves still on, burials still on the green. Any stones were removed in the early 19th century to the new cemetery, to Grove Street Cemetery. This is the oldest surviving hand-drawn map of New Haven, which is in the collections of the Beinecke Library. And I'll just zoom in a little bit. So you see there, this is circa 1748. And in the center there was one church at the time, not the three that we know. And you see the little pictograms of the burial that was done there. And it's to the right here in the sort of undeveloped lands that they decide to do the new cemetery. This again is the same map from 1748, but published later, gives you a little bit clearer sense of the center green, which at the time was not bisected. Temple Street had not been laid out. The streets were not yet named at this time, so you don't see any names. But what would be on the top there is College Street, and you see the first building of Yale in New Haven at the top. So the burial was all in the center green, not terribly organized. So whoever died next was buried to who had been died previously. And it's to the right here that the cemetery is laid out. This is a map of 1802. And again, zooming in, one can see here the new burial ground laid out originally at about 7 acres. It would be expanded later to its current size of about 16 acres. And this gives a sense in 1824, if you look at the top, the cemetery has grown a little bit. But here's something that explains why at this particular time. These are the 2 graves that I know of that indicate one major piece of late 18th century history in New Haven, which is there were outbreaks of yellow fever and of smallpox. You can see at the bottom left here, he died of a lingering consumptive disorder, December 23rd, 1793. And James Rice on the right, he died of the yellow fever, September 29th, 1794. This is a notice from 1794 about this time. And if you were to stare at this and look closely, you will note that it says 160 people died from January to October 1794. 160 out of about 4,000. An extraordinary, it would be the equivalent in 1 year of more than 5,000 people dying in New Haven alone right now. So in this time of pandemic, I think it's interesting to think a little bit that this cemetery is generated in part by pandemics of the past. And James Hillhouse is the great founder of the cemetery, as he is of so much of even what we would consider modern New Haven, laying out the growth of the Farmington Canal. He lived at the top of Hillhouse Avenue in Sachem's Wood. Sachem, indigenous word for chief. Hillhouse was the sort of undisputed big man of New Haven. His family is buried in the cemetery, including his son, James Abraham Hillhouse, who was a bit of a man of leisure and a literary figure, known in his day, but little known in our day. But to give you a sense of how known, the son, James Abraham Hillhouse, this is a poem by him on the right from the collections of the Beinecke Library. And the little notes that you see are done by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was one of the readers and appreciators and admirers of James Abraham Hillhouse. Wanted to just mention a few people who may not be broadly known. So Hillhouse is a name that probably everybody knows. Eli Whitney, buried in the cemetery, is probably a name that all of us are aware of and probably have some idea of what Eli Whitney did. William Grimes, I will be happy if nothing else comes out of tonight than that more people know about William Grimes, who is buried next to the chapel in a family plot, his son-in-law's plot. Grimes is the first person to write a memoir, a first-person account of someone who escaped enslavement. He writes it in 1825. You see that on the right. There are only 8 copies of it left. His great-great-great-granddaughter, Regina Mason, has revived interest and knowledge in her ancestor and worked, and now it's published again. Grimes's life is an extraordinary tale and one that I encourage you. So you can get from Oxford University Press. There's also a documentary that Regina's done. So Grimes, put a note to yourself. Not far from Grimes, a grave, you see this stone, which is new, that commemorates the people, the Amistad captives who won their freedom in 1839. Some went back to West Africa, to what's now Sierra Leone. Some stayed in the New Haven area and died in New Haven. And so this is a stone and some sketches of them. They are buried in what was the African-American plot in what's now the front of the cemetery. It was not the front when it began, but it was, as it was redeveloped, it became really prime real estate. So I think it's sort of an interesting tale of the last shall be first. So when you walk in to the left, you see where Grimes is buried, where Du Bois's grandfather is buried, the stone for the Amistad freedom fighters, the stone for Cortlandt Van Rensselaer Creed, who graduated from the Yale Medical School in 1857, first African-American graduate. And this is the grave of the person who made these sketches, an 18-year-old at the time, of the Townsend family who we mentioned. And then I'm going to power through quickly a few more names to think about. Theodore Winthrop was the first Yalie killed in the Civil War, and probably the first Union officer killed at the Battle of Big Bethel. So he's known for that. But before the war, he was a correspondent and a writer, and he wrote a book called Cecil Dream, which has been republished by NYU Press and was written by him first in the 1850s. We have the manuscript at the Beinecke Library. So for your Halloween reading, I encourage you to think about Cecil Dream, written by one of our Yalie predecessors and pitched as, quote, one of the queerest American novels of the 19th century. So this is written in the 1850s and is about lower New York, the Greenwich Village and an NYU-like place, a Gothic novel at its finest. So Cecil Dream, maybe your Gothic Halloween read. I do want to note great people like Noah Webster, but I want to note him because he's buried with Rebecca Webster, who doesn't get her credit. And Rebecca Webster and Noah had a lovely relationship, according to all the histories and their own correspondence and their correspondence with their children. And she was integral to all that he did work-wise. So our language and our dictionary is really the product of Noah and Rebecca Webster. And this one just is close to the end of my remarks. John Gamble Kirkwood on the left and Lars Onsager buried next to him were, from what I know, friends and fellow scientists. Kirkwood, you'll see, has this stone on the far left with his CV, and it has everything he did. And it's a little talky for a New England cemetery. You don't see many like that in Grove Street or other New England cemeteries. So it's a little, sort of the whole CV, everything he did and accomplished. Onsager dies a little bit later and is buried on the right. And his stone noted that he was a Nobel laureate. And if you look closely, some years later, I'm told it was his kids did this. They put a little asterisk and then did asterisk, etc. So the stone on the right is talking to the stone on the left. And I always think that's a lot of fun. Around the corner from there is the great Josiah Willard Gibbs. And one more that I want to spend just a second talking about that has some Taphophilia and some spookiness to it. Leonard Bacon in the rear here was a minister of the First Church, great Yale graduate, author of the hymn, "O God, Beneath Thy Guiding Hand," sung at commencement for many, many generations. His sister, Delia Bacon, is buried in front, and I encourage you to get to know more about her. Judy Schiff wrote one of her occasional pieces in the Alumni magazine. At the Beinecke Library, we have on the right Delia Bacon's copy of the works of Shakespeare with her handwritten notes. Delia Bacon was one of the people in the 19th century who was big in the Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, and believed that Shakespeare was actually written by some mix of Francis Bacon, no relative, Edmund Spenser, Sir Walter Raleigh, and others. Bacon was so convinced of this that she went to England, and some say she tried to open the grave of Shakespeare and open the grave of Francis Bacon, and believed that there was proof in one of their graves that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. So she's a really interesting figure who there should be more written about. Thomas Clapp on the left, I think we'll probably all hear a lot more about Clapp in the future as Yale reckons with its own history. Those of us in library land know him as the first cataloger. His stone on the left, if you look at it closely, reads, and I love this line, "the laborious and painful president of Yale College, laborious and painful, which I believe in 18th century English means that the Reverend Mr. Clapp was hardworking and paid attention to detail. But the histories I've read of him suggest that he was in fact laborious and painful in the ways that we would use those words. A lesser known library figure who I also want to recommend to those who want to do more digging and history is Edward Claudius Herrick. This Herrick was the first person to have the paid job of a librarian at Yale. And it's thanks to him on the right, one of my favorite objects, the first printing of the United States Constitution. There are only a few dozen of those that survive. Your university and its rare book library have one thanks to Edward Claudius Herrick. Another great collector, Asakawa, is a name that I want to raise for those who don't know him as a potential thread to get to know. First professor of East Asian Studies and really the father of East Asian Studies, great collector and donor of collections that inspire ongoing generations. Norman Holmes Pearson, another great, and this one I like because some will appreciate the legend on Pearson's stone. You'll see it says that he was, quote, son and servant of Yale. And those who knew him tell me that that was in fact an accurate depiction of who he was and how he saw himself. Penultimate slide. Roger Sherman is a man for all seasons in our Taphophilia for all seasons, and certainly as election day comes up, the only signatory of all 4 basic documents of the nation, including, of course, he was on the Committee of 5 that wrote the Declaration of Independence. You see on the right the first printing of that from the Yale Library collections in the Beinecke Library. And every July 4th, people gather at Sherman's grave and have for generations. This year, it may have been one person at Sherman's grave, but I did go. Next year, we pray that circumstances will allow. And I want to close with this one because it, I think, helps put things in perspective in terms of memorials. Theophilus Eaton may be a name that some know, and Eaton may be a name that you sort of think, you know, that name is somewhat familiar. He was the founding governor of the New Haven colony, sort of the political leader with the Reverend John Davenport, founder of the English settlement of New Haven. Eaton is the kind of stone you see, this tablet stone is one that connotes someone of great importance. The fact that it's worn down may not be necessarily a bad thing, because there's some thinking that in Taphophilia, in funerary monuments, when things are worn down completely, that means the soul is completely free. Historic preservationists may have other takes on it, but it's hard to read the legend now. But it says, Eaton so famed, so wise, so meek, so just, the phoenix of our world here hides his dust. This name forget, New England never must. I go by this stone a lot, and I think about Eaton. His name is in some ways forgotten. And that's a reminder to all of us not to have too much self-importance and to have a little humility. But it's also a reminder that cemeteries like Grove Street Cemetery, the first organized chartered burial ground in the country, exist so that we will in fact remember the names of William Grimes, of Sylvia Arden Boone, of John Boswell, of Theophilus Eaton, and of so many others. So with that, I will stop sharing and thank you for going on this with me, and happy to take any questions as well as criticisms and comment. So.
Thank you so much, Michael. I have a ton of questions to get over to you and a handful of comments as well. But I just have to say, I love Grove Street Cemetery. I've visited a number of times, and it's been so fun to listen to you talk about all of these historical figures. But I have to say, my most favorite thing was at the very beginning was the tombstone that said, "What a woman." And I aspire to that. So any of my colleagues or friends that are watching, please remember that for me in the future, because I would like to have that one day. Amazing. Absolutely loved it. So the first comment that I wanted to share is from Michael, who said that as his first year as a Yale Law student, the professor told him that if they were having worries, they should walk across to Grove Street Cemetery and tour it. And I have to say that's probably one of the things that we miss the most about being on campus, those of us who are not able to be in New Haven each day, is being able to visit these special places in New Haven. So
yeah, and I think one of the things to note about that is Mr. Hillhouse would be happy, right? It is private in the sense that it's not a publicly owned cemetery, but it is a public institution, a public purpose. It is run by the descendants, as it were. So I like to sort of describe it as being like a condo. So the families own it, as it were, and there's a governing board made up of proprietors of the cemetery. So that's a question I know we saw. It's open to anybody and has been from the beginning. Importantly, it was never the Yale or even just the Yankee cemetery or even just the Congregational cemetery. At the beginning, there were plots for Yale, for all of the religious associations in town at the time, of which there were 2 Congregational, 1 Methodist, 1 Episcopal. There was a plot for African Americans from the beginning, and there was a plot for what were known as strangers, which meant people who died from elsewhere. At that time, there was not refrigeration, so you were buried where you died. So strangers. And so it was open. I don't want to give a sense that it was equal. So there was definitely status. So the African American was not the high status area as the Yale or First Congregational Society would have been. Again, it's sort of interesting that it is prime real estate now after redevelopment. It's sort of the first thing people see and know. But it remains open. There are still a number of plots available, as well as spaces for cremains. And not to be mercenary about it, but the qualification is basically to plot.
That was one of the next questions I was going to get to. So thank you for getting ahead of that. We do have a few other really great questions, Michael, and we'll try and get as many in as we possibly can. And I just want to remind everyone that this has been recorded and will be available on the Yale Alumni Facebook page and also on Vimeo. So one of the first questions we received was related to the information that you were giving about the scarlet fever and yellow fever burials. Do you know about how many deaths were related to those pandemics, Michael?
So the document that I showed a snippet of is a document we have in was for fun. 60 people died in 1790. 10 months. The disease had been in 1792 instances of pandemics. So it was more than 160. And I've looked at statistics 1780, 1790, 1800. And 1800 even has less than 1790. So it suggests that suggests to me it was 160. It would have been a disease.
So I think we might have lost you a little bit in there, but we can certainly go back and add some of the answers to these questions if in fact we didn't get you the whole time. There was a fun question, Michael, that came across that since it is Halloween season, spooky season, as I've heard people have been saying lately, do you have any interesting stories, maybe not ghost stories, but legends or anything interesting that you can share with us in the spirit of Halloween?
In terms of ghosts, certainly there are people who may think that there are ghosts there. One of the people who works, I saw a question was asked about the previous superintendents, Joan and Bill Cameron. And Joan and Bill were there for decades, dear friends, and now Celie Jennings is the wonderful superintendent. But Bill and Joan were amazing. They went to work literally every day. every day, 365 days, Bill was there. If there was a blizzard, Bill was there. Bill once used his lighter to melt the ice that kept the lock so that he could be there. And one of the current crew told me that he saw Bill in the cemetery not too long ago, i.e. the ghost of Bill. And I can believe it if there are such things as ghosts. Bill and Joan are actually not buried. They have a stone in the cemetery, but they're not buried there. They're buried in West Haven, where they live. But they have a marker there. And I have heard two different thoughts on that. So some people have said, if it's true Bill was there, he's not happy, right? There's something that he wishes was different. But then somebody else said that in fact, that it connotes happiness of a sort in some ways. So different people have different beliefs of ghosts. But if there are such things as ghosts in the Grove Street Cemetery, it would make sense to me that Bill Cameron, who was there 365 days, continues to visit.
Thank you. I have another great question from Sarah. She says, could you comment on Roger Sherman, who is buried there? She is a direct descendant.
Yeah, so I mentioned Sherman, known as sort of the forgotten founding father, right? So people know the name Franklin, Jefferson, Washington. Without Roger Sherman, no nation. Roger Sherman was effectively mayor for life of New Haven, US Senator, treasurer of Yale, and author of the Declaration, very active in the Constitutional Convention. And I guess we could note, he's author, as it were, of the Connecticut Compromise, the creation, as it were, of a bicameral legislature and the sort of small state, large state compromise, which we continue to live with in Electoral College. So maybe we can thank and not thank Mr. Sherman, but it was an important thing at the time to break the logjam so that there could in fact be a constitution and that the nation could survive and grow.
Thank you. So these two questions, I think, go hand in hand a little bit. Could you, Michael, talk a little bit more about the Friends of Grove Street? Because there was a question that came in about some of the tombstones, and they seem to be quite faded. Are there ongoing efforts to restore them? You already addressed that the cemetery is open for visits, and it closes promptly at 4 p.m., which we've learned, which is why we're not physically there today, and we don't have advanced sound equipment in case of weather. But also, is there a listing of all of the names? And is this stuff that Friends of Grove Street does in order to help people kind of navigate the cemetery and plan their visit?
So the Friends of Grove Street works closely with the cemetery administration, the superintendent, and with the governing board of the cemetery. They raise funds to support tombstone restoration historic. So there are a number that have been done. Anybody who's familiar, when you walk in to the immediate left of the chapel is the grave of Ashman, and that has been restored in recent years as one example, and there have been others. So there is some preservation and conservation that's being done from both tombstone and lots of horticultural work. There is a map available physically as well as online of a lot of the significant people buried in the cemetery. And there is a card catalog in the office with everyone. And I think hopes to make that more broadly available, but you can find out on site a lot more right now, but you can find out a fair amount online. And on the cemetery's website, one can find a number of audio tours, and there are tours that have been done with other organizations like the International Festival Horticultural. So there's a fair amount. So if you go to the Grove Street Cemetery website, you can find a fair amount.
Thank you so much. Here, I have another great question that I would like to give to you here about the cemetery having a stone wall rather than a wrought iron fence. Daniel says it's quite a different effect from the perspective of a passerby. It cuts the cemetery off from view, not to mention that the path through the cemetery would be a great convenience to Yaleys. So he's curious about the architecture involved with the gate and the wall around it.
Yeah, so that was done, some decades in. The cemetery was expanded from 7 to 16 acres, and the wall is done 3-4 decades after it was founded. If you sort of think about the area beyond the cemetery to the north and west is beginning to be developed and beginning to become industrialized. So the enclosure of both the metal fence and the wall, the sort of having a sort of hard enclosure, is done because lots of people were cutting through and not really respecting the cemetery. And the city is becoming a city, frankly. It was going from, a community of 5,000 when it was established in the early 1790s. And so it was meant to be a physical barrier on that sort of back side with the front side open. And obviously things have developed differently over time. There have been conversations that people have had, but the trustees, I think rightly, said that it's the right thing, the historic wall. And it's, at most a modest inconvenience to walk around, and it's good for our health to do it. And I'm happy to say there's lots more people who visit the cemetery intentionally. And that's partly because the Friends and others have done things in the current moment, the current months, people, the pandemic does it. But as the development has happened around the redevelopment of Elmhaven, the development now of the 2 new residential colleges, and there really is sort of central areas, there's a lot more foot traffic and people who then sort of think about it and think, oh, I'll go in there. Maybe not as they're passing by, but they sort of think about it. So there's definitely been more people going in intentionally and respectfully, which is a great thing.
Absolutely. We have another comment related to Yale President Ezra Stiles, and you showed his monument at the beginning. Our commenter says that you probably know that Stiles' grandson Jonathan is buried next to him in the plot. Could you talk at all about that? Do you have any additional information about that?
No, but I think we should say to Russell, maybe we'll have you on for one of the Yale Alumni Live.
Yes, Russell, I will find out your email and we will be in touch.
Fair warning if you offer those kinds of things. And it is the kind of thing that question of, wanting to know more about somebody is, again, why Hillhouse established this, that it would be an inspiration and both tell you something, but also be a prompt to go find out more. So careful, folks. We might get you on for our next episode. There was another question about whether or not you're familiar with the limerick on the back of the bench that is on the roadway to the left of the entrance. Are you familiar with that? I am, and it's Betsy and Harry Welch, and I don't know if the questioner knew Betsy and know Harry, and the Welches are people, lovely people, and they have a family plot, and then there is this bench, and on the back, I forget, I should have written it down, it really is quite wonderful. It basically says, sit here, Betsy and Harry want you to. And it's a lovely touch. And sometimes people in cemeteries are like, would see that and I've noticed people sometimes as I'm sitting there, people walk by and look at me and they sort of think like, what, is that guy being disrespectful sitting on that bench? But in fact, the bench is there. And so it's a good point. And anybody who's watching, who's in the cemetery, next time you're there, as the questioner notes, when you take a left on the path that's along the Grove Street side, you'll see a wonderful granite, I think it's granite bench. Sit on it, but also look around the back. There is lovely lines from the Welches.
I love that. I love these stories of Grove Street Cemetery. Michael, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We did have a few more questions. There were several questions relating to how to access Grove Street Cemetery, whether or not people can visit, because folks have joined at various times throughout the evening. And the bottom line is yes, you absolutely can visit from, I think it's 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., right, Michael?
Yeah.
And it's
365 days.
And it's accessible, and there's only one entrance, is that right?
Right.
Okay, and that is on across from, give us a direction really quick.
Right across from Book and Snake and the Law School, so effectively at High Street and Grove Street.
And if anybody's traveling into New Haven, I have noticed that the Broad Street parking lot, or Broadway, has not been charging. So you might be able to get away with parking there for free for an hour or two. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Folks, thank you so much for all of your questions. We've gotten so many comments and questions on Facebook and in Zoom. I think, let's see, the last one that I think we will do quickly is if you could reiterate, and I'm not sure, Michael, because I was multitasking, you might have addressed this, but if there is a story behind the grave of the governor of Liberia, is that something that you're familiar with?
So that's the Ashman grave, I think, is probably what they're talking about, who was head of part of the American Colonial Society and was the first colonial governor of Liberia. And many would know Liberia, is the sort of back to Africa, sponsored by white abolitionists in many ways, and the American Colonial Society. So Ashman, whose name we know because it's the street, is buried in the cemetery, was not a New Havener, but knew many New Haveners, and the American Colonization Society was very active among sort of moderate white abolitionists in New Haven and Connecticut. He contracts illness in Liberia and I suppose knows he's going to die, and comes to New Haven to die and be buried, and asks to be buried in the African-American plot. So he's a white man, and sort of the integration move, the first integration move in the cemetery is Ashman asking to be buried in what was historically the African-American. So when you go in, Ashman's grave is, you see the stone for the Amistad captives who won their freedom, Ashman, and then the Creed family, including Cortlandt Creed, great African-American graduate of Yale.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to end on that note. I am so grateful to everyone who has joined us this evening, to you, Michael, for your time and for going through such an outrageously amazing presentation that I feel like you have completely memorized at this point. So you probably didn't even need the PowerPoint.
The secret to share with everybody, what they teach you at Divinity School is you only need one sermon. It's just the opening and need to be different.
Well, thank you again.
That was my sermon.
I loved it. Thank you so much, everyone who is watching. As a reminder, this will be available for viewing in the Yale Alumni Facebook group and on Yale Alumni Vimeo. And I did get a lot of comments about the video at the beginning, so I'm actually going to play that once again as you all leave for the evening, just for you to enjoy the sights of Grove Street Cemetery in this beautiful time of year in New Haven. We wish you all well and hope that you will come back and join us for another Yale Alumni Live. Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us tonight. All right, I'm going to get that video up for everybody, and we will see you again soon. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. I guess that's all for tonight. Thank you so much, Michael. It was really a pleasure to work with you on this, and to everyone who still hung out to watch the end of that video. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful Halloween and happy Thanksgiving, and come back again. We're going to be doing
Thanks,
tons of
Stephanie.
these in
Good night.
November. Thank you so much.